All right, so the food agricultural revolution changed. It really stabilized the population, but that's not really what causes the population to really increase dramatically in the earth. It's other factors that, if you look back over the millions of years that people have been around, you had a fairly stable population around the Neolithic revolution, around 2,000 years ago. And I should clarify, not everybody stopped being hunter and gatherers at once. It was a slow process. But as you did, as people began to farm, their population steadily grew at a very slow and stable rate. There was a drop during the Black Plague, which killed off a lot of people. Then it bounced back. But suddenly here, you have this dramatic, this dramatic liftoff fairly recently. And so we want to talk about what's happening here and where that's going to go. And this really coincides with the Industrial Revolution. And that began in Europe around 1750, 1800, thereabouts, and new technologies, and not just like steam engines and things like that, but technologies in the sense of new ways of organizing humans to work, that instead of people, a single craftsman producing a good, you had assemblies of people who were producing goods. And this caused a real change in the way humans live. It causes a change in the way that we could produce food, how we could distribute things. And it also brought a lot of people into cities. And as people were brought into cities, people started to understand things more like sanitation. So a whole bunch of changes start taking place during the Industrial Revolution. And one side effect of these multiple changes is that decreased the death rate. And that dramatic population growth that we see, and I'm going to show a video that goes along with this, is that you have a dramatic population growth not because more babies are born, but because fewer people are dying. So let's kind of investigate that for a moment, that your population is going to be determined by two factors: how many babies are being born and how many people are dying. You get more babies or less deaths, you get growth, or the other way around. If you have more deaths, less babies, you get shrinking populations. So the population change is really the birth rate minus the death rate. There's more math that can go into that, but I just want you to understand this on an intuitive level. Get more babies, or there's two ways to grow the population: either more babies, more births, or fewer deaths. And the great population increase since the Industrial Revolution is really not because of birth rates going down, it's really going up. I mean, it's because death rates go down. So if we've had this really surge of population since the 1850s because of our death rates going down, what can we do to slow population growth? Well, I guess there's sort of two options. One kind of bad, we could have more deaths. We don't want that, obviously. But you also have what's called the birth rate solution, because we want to just kill people off. That's no good. What you want to do, the way that can change in the future is if the birth rates go down. And that's what we see happening in a lot of the industrialized world, is their population growth is slowing because people are having fewer children or having children later. And this is called the demographic change. And we'll be talking about this throughout the course. This is called the demographic transition. The idea is that before the Industrial Revolution, we had a high death rate and a high birth rate. So the birth rate was high, but a lot of people died, especially a lot of children died during childbirth. You had a high child mortality rate. And so even though a lot of babies were being born because of the lack of survival, the population growth wasn't that high. Now, later on, with new technologies and things like that, as the death rate starts to drop, the birth rate doesn't immediately follow. The birth rate kind of people don't immediately start having less kids, but fewer people are dying. And so that's when the total population really starts to make a big jump here. Now, what's been happening since that time as we've kind of gone through industrialization and gotten more, people get more educated in general, where people have careers and don't necessarily start having children so early, and various other societal factors, that over time the birth rate has started to come down. And in fact, in some places like in Europe, the birth rate has become so low that it's actually gone below the death rate. And you actually have places where the population, instead of growing, is actually starting to shrink because of the very low birth rate. But this isn't, so we can't make statements about the world as a whole. We have to also look at development. And development is kind of like, our country's more industrialized or less industrialized, how wealthy the country is. And this is an oversimplification. Sometimes they're referred to as more developed countries and less developed countries, and that's shorthand for sort of richer and poorer countries. It's not always a good fit. Some countries might be called newly industrialized countries because they may have some of the characteristics of each. They might have a whole lot of new factories, but they still might have a lot of people living in the rural environment who are farmers and in poverty. So you have, here's one way to look at it. The more developed countries are these high-income economies like the US, Canada, Western Europe, Australia. And then you have kind of those in the middle, like Brazil and Mexico and Russia. And then you have those at the lower end, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and some other parts of the world. And so it's not just the world is more complicated than to put them into two buckets, but generally speaking, you have kind of these higher, countries with more wealth and resources and those that have less. And the reason where we're going with this is that also affects the population growth. That countries that are less developed and are less industrialized tend to have higher birth rates. These are population pyramids, or called age structure diagrams. And what it's showing is how much people are in the population in different age cohorts, 0 to 4, 4 to 9, and so on. So these are the youngest, and these are the oldest. And where you see one that's wide at the bottom, that indicates a growing population. So in Niger, in sub-Saharan Africa, these are a little bit out of date, but they have a growing population in this example. The United States is much different. It looks a little bit like Germany, but Germany is more of an extreme example. Germany is highly industrialized, and one thing different about it you'll notice is that because they have a low birth rate, they have a much smaller population in the younger kids. The United States is like Germany, but our birth rate is a little higher, so it's not quite as narrow. We're kind of moving in that direction. So different kinds of countries have different kinds of population growth. And if you look at sort of the less developed countries versus more developed countries, there are different patterns. So when we're concerned about population growth in the world, it's not a uniform problem. It's usually, it's not a uniform concern, I should say, that in some places they're concerned about in the other direction, that they don't have enough population growth. In other places, there is more concern about population growth, and it's not because you're worried about having more people, it's that you're worried about being able to feed all of those people, having the resources for them all, and that's where the concern comes in.